This is the workbench I built from 22 2x4s and 3 sheets of plywood. Because my current garage has tall ceilings, it has a lofted storage shelf. And it also has a shelf for tool and box storage below. I used 2 sheets of 3/4 inch builder grade plywood for the lower and upper storage shelves, and a 1/2 inch sheet of sanded ply for the main workbench. The dimensions were carefully chosen so that all of the excess can be used for reinforcing sheathing. The first piece of 3/4 inch plywood I cut into an 8 foot by 30 inch lofted storage shelf, and the remainder 8 foot by 17 7/8 inches section was used as sheathing along the back of the top shelf. The second piece of 3/4 inch plywood was cut into a 2x4 foot sheet to be used as sheathing on the side, a 6x2 foot sheet to be used on the bottom shelf, and a 6 by 23 7/8 inch piece to be sheathing along the back. The fancy 1/2 inch sanded plywood was used for a 6x3 foot piece for the main workbench surface, which left a 2x4 foot section for a side sheathing panel and a 6 by 11 7/8 inch panel to be used on the back sheathing. Then I made a lot of sawdust, cutting up a whole lot of 2x4s for the 3 frames for the shelves and the 4 legs and 12 shelf support jack studs. The bottom shelf frame is 6 feet by 2 feet. The workbench frame is 6 feet by 3 feet, and the lofted storage shelf is 8 feet by 30 inches. The frames are nailed together with 16D nails for strength. I wanted 14 inches under my bottom shelf, which is the perfect size to store a small moving box, so my bottom jack studs were 14 inches long. The jack studs between my bottom shelf and my workbench frame were 20 inches tall, which is just enough room for my mini table saw and chop saw. I gave myself 36 inches between the workbench and the lofted storage shelf because I had enough ceiling height to support it. Don't forget to add the thickness of the plywood to the 2x4 frame when you are calculating your leg and jack stud lengths. I attached the bottom jack studs to the legs with screws while I was making sure the legs would stand level, and then used 8D nails for the load-bearing strength. I got fancy and put the back 2 on at a 90-degree angle, but you really don't have to do that. Then I put the bottom shelf frame onto the legs and affixed them with 2 1/2 inch exterior deck screws. I used deck screws so that I could disassemble the workbench if I needed to move it later. I only put a single screw into each corner so that I could still twist the legs to make them all level and square before affixing the back sheathing. Here's where I used my first bit of extra plywood as reinforcing sheathing along the back of the bottom shelf. It also serves to keep things from dropping off the bottom shelf. I held it up with a single screw in the middle and then pulled everything into square before screwing it into both legs and the rest of the frame. I then added 4 20-inch jack studs to the inside of the legs, resting on top of the bottom shelf, to hold up the workbench frame. I used a piece of 6 feet by 23 7/8 inch leftover from one of the 3/4 inch plywood sheets as the reinforcing sheathing here, which also keeps things from going off the back of the workbench. The only thing remaining is the 8 foot long by 30 inches wide lofted storage shelf. If you are willing to hang the back of the frame off the end of your workbench and support all the weight on only 8 16D nails, you wouldn't have to do any joinery here. However, I wanted the back frame rail supported by the jack stud and leg, so I cut a 1 1/2 inch slot so that the top frame would be flush with the legs and the back rail would be supported on top of the jack stud and leg. The front rail is only supported by the 16D nails through the 2 cantilevered studs. I used my 8 foot by 17 7/8 inch extra from the top shelf as reinforcing sheathing on the back top. The 2 extra 2x4 sheets were used as reinforcement sheathing on the left and right sides. I put the fancy sanded ply up top and I mount various things to it, and the ugly 3/4 inch is down low where it is hidden behind a cabinet. Let me demonstrate why we put sheathing on the sides. This end wiggles. This end doesn't. So that's why we're going to put sheathing on this side too. That's the basic construction, but I added a few finishing touches that are well worth it. I used a router to cut slots in the top of the lofted shelf frame so that I could install rope lighting to illuminate the workbench before I screwed down the plywood as the shelf. I had such a long bit of rope light that I also ran the remainder under the workbench to make it easy to see the tools on the bottom shelf. I also bought some shelf rails and brackets from Home Depot to add a few shelves on the rear of the workbench and used some extra pegboard I had to give me a place to mount some tools.